All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last live SILA Foundation webinar of 2019. I'm Cindy Davidson from ExamFX. I'm the Education Trustee for SILA Foundation. And thanks everybody for making time to join us today. For those of you, quick announcement, for those of you who are SILA designees, yes, this webinar will count towards your CE requirement, and no, it's not your last opportunity to earn hours. We have a way for you to view a recording of the of one or two of this year's previous webinars, so there's still time. You'll be getting emails about that from SILA. And let's see. Okay, so that I think is it. This is our 10th webinar. So we, I think, have had a really successful run this year and just have been so lucky to have some of the best presenters, I think, ever. So, and I think we're going to continue that streak today because we'll be discussing selling insurance in the digital age, and who better to lead this conversation than Commissioner Barbara Richardson. Barbara Richardson assumed the role of Insurance Commissioner for Nevada in 2016. Before that, Ms. Richardson had served for 12 years as the Director of Operations and Fraud for the New Hampshire Insurance Department. Prior to that, she worked a bunch of jobs in the insurance industry at a number of insurance and financial services firms. Barbara graduated from Vassar College and earned her law degree from Loyola University in Chicago. But best of all, she has been, I think for more than 15 years, a huge friend and supporter of SILA, and has served as a regulatory representative and panelist at several SILA annual conferences. She's been an active member of the NAIC's various task forces, working groups, and committees, including the Innovation Task Force, the Anti-Fraud Task Force, and the SURF Board. So I hope everyone will welcome Commissioner Richardson as she teaches us everything there is to know about selling insurance in the digital age. If you have questions as we go through, please enter them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end. And without further ado, take it away, Commissioner Richardson.
Thank you. And I do want to thank everybody at SILA. It is a great organization, and I was very happy to do this. But I will tell you, I'm not going to tell you everything. I don't think that's how life works. All I can do is make you think a little bit. I will tell you, I did get asked originally to present a day in the life of a commissioner, but honestly, every day is different. Every day has technical pieces, political pieces. Some are short-term projects we work on, some are long-term projects. So what I try to do is actually focus this particular presentation to licensing and licensing sort of ideas and licensing in the digital age. So the first thing I want to talk about is the title. So does your avatar need a license? So I just want to talk about what avatars are because there's different definitions, but the one we're going to be focusing on is the incarnation, embodiment, or manifestation of a person or idea. So many people know avatar under the alternative definition, which is an icon or figure representing a particular person in video games or internet forums. And while many folks on this webinar may not think they have an avatar because they don't play video games, most people have at least one from Facebook. And I have a couple avatars up on the screen right now, including the female frog from Facebook. They used to give us all the That Girl haircut. So now you can actually choose a different avatar for your Facebook page. And you can turn it into all kinds of lovely symbols and cartoon characters, and all that can be done online. But again, it is your digital presence. So the other day, as I was listening to one of my staff explain to a group of insurance carrier representatives who had come to visit the insurance division, he kept saying insurance is a relationship business. So he presented this idea to explain how insurance carriers and its sales force would best interact with the staff here at the division and with their customers. He was seeming to suggest that no type of computer-supported customer interaction or consumer interaction between an insurance producer sales force and a consumer would ever be replaced. I found this concept very interesting given the vast amount of innovative changes we have all seen and experienced here in the U.S., not just in the insurance markets, but in the way different generations interact and how everyone seems to have the ability to use technology to get information quickly. I think everyone can agree that generations are all different, and even if you try to generalize about these generational traits, we as consumers in the U.S. take in and deliver information in new, innovative ways, no matter our generational position. Technology is mainstream. Gone are the days of Rolodexes, and some of you may not even remember them, but we now have contacts. Telephone calls have been replaced by emails, and even the use of email is quickly being replaced by text. And I'm sure I do not have to remind everyone about the use of Twitter and tweeting. As an insurance or security sales profession, this transition time can be challenging. It may require that you learn a myriad of different ways to reach and interact with your potential and existing clients. It's just as challenging for regulators and compliance professionals. There are new ways to interact, and these new ways come with challenges, but also have some huge benefits. The challenges include issuances with language mostly, nuances, vocabulary, and the volume of data issues. For example, on nuances, texts and emails can be quickly read, but people tend to misread them based on their own feeling and focus at the time they have actually read the message. This can cause misunderstanding and sometimes angst. When we talk about vocabulary, sometimes the use of slang or the use of acronyms going to be used affect what audiences may hear or what audiences you may be trying to reach. They heard about a new internet marketing position in the field. For example, I'll tell you a story. I heard about a new internet marketing position in the field of cannabis. And I know this is a little off topic, but it was really interesting because the job was to sample a different type of cannabis every day and to video log the use and your description of the flavors. There's also talk about the ease of intake and the physical and psychological effects of each sample. One of the application requirements is that you needed to provide 6 slang terms for cannabis so that the hiring staff would be able to determine if you were qualified. This type of control also brings in its own bias concerns, which might be fine for a job application, but word choice can create a bias situation when incorporated into an online entity. For example, I am sure I do not know the most recent slang for cannabis, but would that make or not make me a good candidate for this position? I'd have to be dragging my 1960s definitions and vocabulary. So the other issue is the volume of information. Massive amount of volume of information has come through the internet. You can go online, type any word in, and you get so many hits and so much information that it's hard to discern what is viable, good information and what might just be internet noise. All of that affects how consumers think about or react to information that you're trying to reach out and provide them. But if you decide to embrace the challenge that technology allows, chatbots and robots using machine learning and the use of AI interfaces can be your friends. Chatbots can present little bites of information and feed it out so that it's not overwhelming. They can also be incorporated with AI interfaces who will talk online to your potential consumer forever, should they want that while you are working with another client or actually taking a nap. No one reads their insurance contract, so you might also think about how you can present that information to consumers to have them really understand the value of the product they are buying. You can use the new automation tools to overcome this type of consumer apathy. For example, you could turn the reading of an insurance contract into a podcast for consumers to listen to rather than read. Many consumers will still want a copy of the policy, and regulatory requirements do require that, but having it in verbal format would be very helpful for most people. If you treat it like other podcast offerings, consumers would just download the podcast and listen to it on their own time and at their own convenience. One of the concerns in doing this, though, may be the tone and tenor of the podcast. Would you use a monotone presentation? Would it be more likely an interactive session? And would that be more welcome and better understood by your consumers? The nuances of language must always be considered because the idea is to try and get the consumers to better understand their rights and responsibilities without creating possible misinterpretations. Monotone presentations with little inflection are likely to create misinterpretations, but they're also less likely to be listened to at all. So you might not ever reach the market you're hoping to reach. So the biggest issue, though, is any of these types of automation-based tools need to be first viewed in the context of the current federal and state laws. Anyone who has tried this experience or this exercise will understand that automation and innovation do not always fit neatly into the current legal code, which was written prior to the introduction of these new innovative tools. However, legal codes provide a good source for the intention of the drafters, which can be useful in this analysis. I do have one caveat that should be addressed while we're performing this analysis, though. No matter what the answer we get, it is important to go through the exercise so that you know if you need to change the code to embrace the new technology tools, or if you need to consider alternative controls or protections that bubble up when you're reviewing the technology tools under old laws. In this case, on this webinar, I'm going to focus on the case of insurance licensing for producers, as the bulk of the listeners in this webinar probably have some familiarity with this process. The process is generally the same for other types of licenses, but you will need to step through the federal regulations and state codes that pertain to those particular licenses. First, we would look to Title III, Section 336 of Public Law Number 106 through 102, which is the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. And this is where the definition of insurance producer is found. So Section 336 defines insurance producer as meaning any insurance agent or broker, surplus lines broker, insurance consultant, limited insurance representative, and any other person that solicits, negotiates, effects, procures, delivers, renews, continues, or binds policies of insurance or offers advice, counsel, opinions, or services related to insurance. This is an exceptionally broad definition, especially when it runs into the clause beginning "and any other person." And this is where the rub against the definition of entities with artificial intelligence begins. After we review another such definition, we can start to see where the concerns will lie. The next step in the evaluation will be to review the state statutes that provide the definition for what the state will use to determine whether a person must be licensed as an insurance producer. Rather than look at any one particular state statute, I'm going to refer to Section 3 of the Producer Licensing Model Act that was drafted by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. It states that a person shall not sell, solicit, negotiate insurance in the state for any class or class of insurance unless the person is licensed for that line of authority in accordance with this act. After reviewing the statement, we see that we need a definition of person and the terms sell, solicit, and negotiate to determine if an automation tool can be a person and what does it mean to sell, solicit, or negotiate insurance policies. Section 2L defines a person under the Producer Licensing Model Act as an individual or a business entity, and Section 2 defines a business entity as a corporation, association, partnership, legal liability company, limited liability partnership, or other legal entity. The terms sell, solicit, or negotiate fall under Sections 2, M, N, and K, respectively. M for sell means to engage a contract of insurance by any means for money or its equivalent on behalf of an insurance company. Solicit means attempting to sell insurance or asking or urging a person to apply for a particular kind of insurance from a particular company. Negotiate means the act of conferring directly or offering advice directly to a purchaser or prospective purchaser of a particular contract of insurance concerning any of the substantive benefits, terms, or conditions of the contract, provided that the person engaged in that act either sells insurance or obtains insurance from insurers for purchasers. So it would appear at first blush that none of the technology tools would be considered a person, so we do not have to determine if they can sell, solicit, or negotiate. This might only be true today. The European Commission, which was set up through Article 17 of the Treaty on the European Union, is responsible for proposing legislation, implementing, scrutinizing, and upholding European Union treaties for EU members. They also review and debate potential EU policies and protocols to help members come together to determine overall policy strategies for the EU as a whole. Strategies meant to protect the interests of the EU and its citizens on issues that can't be dealt with effectively on a national level. The EU Commission has been reviewing the concerns created by newer uses of computer systems and the automation tools that have been created that may create a system that eventually becomes independent from its designer or creator. At this point in time, the legal systems in the EU and the US do not recognize that a robot or a system using AI could be held independently responsible for any acts or omissions that the robot performs, even if those acts or omissions cause damages to other or third parties. The claim is that they are a machine, and thus any and all liability rests on the owner. As such, even though the current legal system does not yet recognize that a system using AI is not a person or a separate legal entity, The person with control or the owner is responsible for any acts of the system. However, in October of 2017, Saudi Arabia bestowed citizenship on a robot named Sophie, and her picture is up on the screen now. And if you get some time, you should spend some time looking at some of the YouTube videos on her, as she is expressive, articulate, and even funny. And she has quite a few presentations and quite a few things to say, including a couple digs at Elon Musk. So it's quite interesting to watch her interact with the crowd. Well, this grant of citizenship was really a marketing and publicity stunt. It has pushed new discussions regarding the ethics of pronouncing any type of robot or AI-controlled machine as an electronic person. Originally, the older forms of the systems that attempted to create AI were less intelligent than we are seeing today. The AI entity was mainly implementing a set of rules given to it by its human developer. The original forms were based on human coders providing decision tree type programs, or, if you will, a series of if-then processes that could be processed very quickly. Some current AI entity creators are trying to use the same type of punishment reward system that you would use in teaching or training animals to try and control the interactions of the AI entity. They claim that this can create a personality for the AI entity, which can be better understood and hopefully controlled. As of right now, deep machine learning and AI entities are originally created with distinct focus and personalities, but over time the system begins to teach itself through its interactions. This is when a black box situation is created. But unlike other black box data sets, these new black box processing algorithms are no longer controlled nor necessarily understood by the original coder. It can be akin to looking at two children who are each brought up at the same time and the exact same way, but as adults they think about things very differently. This is where regulators and compliance professionals really start to get nervous. And this is where the legal concerns also come into play. Any system that learns from its interactions with the outside world can act in ways that were unintended by its creator and potentially never even predicted or conceived by that creator. There are also issues of concern that the AI entity will act in direct conflict to the intentions of the creator. For example, it was discovered that when an AI entity that was originally introduced to provide consumer service to folks was introduced to another AI entity that was programmed to act as a consumer, the original consumer rep AI entity began to speak in shorthanded code and so rapidly that no human could determine what it was saying. The consumer rep entity had learned a new way of interacting, but could not alter its newly learned behavior, and thus its new way to interact. So you may also have heard the same issue happen when an AI entity was opened onto the internet to learn about how to be human. It learned through its exposure to a massive amount of data to be a white supremacist, so the experiment ended up being pulled. Due to the fact that we all realize that there are now more and more sophisticated robots or systems using AI technology, the nations of the world are starting to consider that it may be time to create the status of an electronic person, which will provide legal rights and responsibilities in those interactions, where the electronic person makes independent decisions or otherwise interacts with third parties independent of their owner or designer. So let's think about a normal insurance scenario. Many insurance carriers are marketing directly to consumers without an agent. They're also becoming more and more automated in their presentations. What if a carrier decided to use AI or machine tools? Would they initially be based on personality of their staff? And then which staff? Marketers, claim handlers, or underwriters? The initial focus of the staff's job function, as well as the personality for performing that function well, would be incorporated into the new electronic person. But would those new electronic persons resonate with the different types of consumers that they might be interacting with? Each of these, I'll call them tools, but they're electronic persons, would only need its own license as an electronic person if the insurer carrier was not the owner or controller under the license exemption of the PLMA. But without that exemption, insurance agencies are in a different boat when they try to start incorporating these kind of tools. So what if an AI entity developed a personality of its own? Would that create a new staff member for the carrier agency? If so, the new personality may be one completely unimagined by the creator. For now, the carrier would be fully liable for the acts and omissions of that AI entity, but not so in the future. So let's chat a little bit about marketing versus soliciting. These two terms have their definitions interwoven already for very many people. The use of AI tools will only increase the potential interplay and confusion over the definition of these words, not just to consumers, but to regulators and compliance professionals. Are AI and machine learning tools really sales tools? What about the line between these tools and chatbots? Chatbots are currently assumed to be what is known as staged-for-purpose tools. Staging tools are more akin to having a fill-in-the-blank form that can help to gather data for submission to a carrier. They might be likened to a consumer representative who works for an insurance carrier or in an agent's office, gathering data for review and submission by the carrier or the lead agent. But AI machine learning tools can actually be programmed to sell through the use of interactive online dialogues and alternative product presentations, depending on consumer input with the interaction. This kind of selling can occur outside the normal cycles and can be personalized to the audience. This can also be supported through initial online data gathering that can be interpreted and manipulated to meet consumer needs, desires, risk profiles, or even some consumer weaknesses to sales presentations. This is where a concern comes in. While everyone understands that as an agent or broker, your first goal is to meet the needs of a consumer, a self-taught AI program might have developed an alternative goal. Their focus might only be to make the sale. This is where good system controls make all the difference. Last year, there were several experiments done surrounding the use of AI as a potential tool to use to interact with consumers. Several issues came from these experiments. As I mentioned earlier, the first is that the initial AI training could be manipulated by interactions with other AI entities, and thus wiping out the initial training controls that the original AI was programmed with. Another issue is one like we're looking at the screen right now, where the AI basically takes over the functions of the consumer that they're actually interacting with. Another issue that drives concerns from regulators and compliance professionals in these systems is that people have biases. So systems have biases and people have biases, and one would always hope that the systems would be able to get the bias somehow coded out of them. And it was originally thought that these biases would be overcome with the use of lots of data. The problem they have discovered is that the underlying data is biased. A large tech company, for example, tried to use an AI-developed algorithm to assess recruits for coding positions. They used the data from their current pool of coders to determine the best attributes for a successful coder. A problem showed up when they noticed that the bulk of the new potential coders suggested by the algorithm were male, even though the algorithm did not specifically place any weight on gender. It was discovered that the algorithm was using the current pool of coders, which was mostly male, to find new coders. Thus, it looked for a mostly male pool. This is not the intent of the coder, but the algorithm had to be scrapped. So I do realize that some of this information seems like it will be useful in the future and only will be put into play in the business of insurance very far in the future. But I have to caution you, don't get caught up in the fantasy. There are think tanks and professional tech innovators that are even now trying to figure out how to enter the insurance producer world, and we need to consider how we react, as our current legal controls might not be helpful in divining how to support good technology or to control the use of harmful technology tools. As it stands right now, quite a few IT folks are calling this the fourth revolution, much like the Industrial Revolution, and what they're claiming is that this new change requires us to look at ethics, moralities, tools, legal systems, and just general interactions with our human design. And at this point, I'm going to hold for any questions in case you guys want to chat a little bit. And I do have a couple of slides that have some references, which will obviously be printed out later. So if there's any questions, we can go ahead.
I don't know that I have a question, Barbara, but I'm really interested in the whole concept of, how compliance is supposed to respond to this machine learning, artificial intelligence, having the ability to sell. I think the whole world is struggling with algorithms, misbehaving algorithms these days, and I'm just curious of what's the level of alarm at the NAIC about the ability to regulate these kinds of things?
it's interesting. I would suggest that the level of alarm is not very high, and it's not because they aren't coming and that things aren't happening. The level of alarm is fairly, I would say it's low boiling, because most of the commissioners and the regulators probably at this point understand that the industry themselves, the folks who are in the industry, aren't ready for this yet. They're trying to figure out where their own liability lies. So if they're still trying to figure out that piece of it, they're going to be very suspect of anybody who jumps out too quickly. So that I think that we're able to sort of take some control because of the fact that people are taking a step-by-step approach. But it's not just NEIC. I would suggest any kind of compliance area. And the only other thing that sort of comes to play when you're looking at compliance and compliance issues that is of interest is trying to figure out, again, where the line is drawn between when one of these entities is independent and when it actually is just and I'll call it an avatar for the person who is actually trying to do the sales pitch. I think the thing that scares most regulators is when it crosses that line, because, again, the designers can't even control that. And if they can't control it, then you sort of have to back up from there. So one of the things that's probably interesting to know is in the field of autonomous vehicles, which is probably the most far along in these kind of controls, they actually have found that when you're taking your autonomous vehicle to the top level, that those particular vehicles actually have personalities. Some of them drive very aggressively, some of them drive very passively, and even though they've all been programmed to follow the law, they have also taken on the traits of the person who was taught or who they used to teach to drive them. So I think that is one of the issues that we're sort of looking at in general, because basically if you're talking about an IT person doing coding, that's one thing. If they start taking on the personality traits of a salesperson, that's another thing. If they're taking on the salesperson or the personality of somebody who's going to potentially be a fraudster, that's huge. And figuring out where in that black box that you can actually do some controls is just probably a little nerve-wracking for everybody but the fraudsters.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about the implications for fraud. We have a question about the EU. If there is an anticipated date when there's a decision expected?
No, so the European Parliament had made the request of the EU Commission in order to try to do some kind of white paper or something that helps them move forward. The only reason I really brought them up is that they're further along than the U.S. in actually trying to focus on these issues. But right now, the latest they have is early 2019 starting date for their research. And you know, though the Sophie and the artificial person or the electronic person is interesting, that's, again, I think that's a stunt. So I don't think that we're going to see that coming anytime soon, which means that for the time being, the law as it stands is if you are controlling a machine or you own a machine, no matter how far or how far-reaching its interaction with consumers is going to be, you're liable.
So this would be one of those instances where being early to market is probably not going to work out for the best for the companies.
Probably not, no.
That's what I'm hearing you say. But this raises all kinds of questions within the producer licensing community. I think, if I'm extrapolating this correctly, you know, there's going to be challenges to. We've already struggled with internet-based sales, right? So how do we know where these are resident in terms of resident licensing? How are those standards going to be applied? And then, you know, it makes me wonder what new kinds of information do new agents need to have in hand as artificial intelligence change that in terms of, you know, what do you need to know in order to be a producer?
Yeah, and I would suggest that as it stands right now, there's a lot of great tools, and I talked a little bit about some of them, where you can have chatbots I mean, they will literally talk to your customers all day and all night. And I think most agents have had people who just want to talk. And having the ability to have that interaction without it being time-consuming or a burden on the consumer, because sometimes consumers need to have all that interaction in order to get comfortable with where they're falling out or whether or not they want to buy something. So you just have to figure out how to use the tools that are available now, and just make sure that they're not being, I don't know, I hate to say this, is being manipulated, because I think that's one of my fears, is that everyone thought the AI chatbot, or not, excuse me, not chatbot, the AI electronic person that was going to be able to be a consumer rep. I don't think they really thought about the fact that interactions with other AI entities would turn that entity into just a useless data computer. It lost all of its ability to interact with the consumers as it was hoped to do. So, I hate to, say gloom and doom, because I don't think everything is gloom and doom. I think you just have to march through each one of these and figure out how to reach your consumers in a new and better and innovative ways. The thing that I think new producers or brokers need to be thinking about, though, is that the carriers are trying to do the same thing. There's a group of folks at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law who are working together to try to create what they call robo-advisors, which sounds like robocalls, but it's not really that. It's really the allowance to have people put data in, and then the advisor puts them or shows them the different company products that are available. So it almost acts like a broker. And they've been working on that project for about 1.5 years now. They have not just computer folks, they have legal folks, they also have psychological and social behavior and marketing folks working on it. So those are the kind of tools that it sounds good, but if they become a competitor, you need to be ready to actually make some move before that becomes the only way to buy insurance.
Interesting. Well, I have to admit the most fascinating idea I think you posed was the idea of a podcast of your insurance contract. I mean, if people aren't reading their contracts, which is completely true, how might the insurance industry reinvent itself in terms of getting information to customers in kind of on an as-needed basis or just-in-time basis? Okay, to use a recent example of someone who maybe has a teenager who just learned to drive. So my daughter hit a car on her way home from school, and everybody can feel sorry for me because she's 17, and I'm like, here we go. But it was a parked car, and I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think a consumer would want to know instantly, what's my liability, what's covered, how do we report this, that kind of information I think could be made available electronically without you having to pick up and call your agent.
And there's also the ability, which I haven't seen yet, which I'd love to see, is different types of contracts that are searchable for consumers, not just the folks at the companies who are using them, but allowing the consumers to go right to those spots where it talks about what are the exemptions, what does it cover. Yes, there's a plus to reading the entire thing, but at least I'll get some of the quick answers taken care of.
Right. What's my deductible? What do I need to pay? What do I do in case of an accident? Those would be the kinds of things I think people want to access without having to pull out, their contract and blow the dust off it and try to, figure it out for themselves. So we have another question that's just come in about licensing in terms of how does this compare, or what are the implications for direct-to-consumer sales in terms of licensing requirements?
So the real issue for me on the direct-to-consumer sales, I assume it's coming from the companies themselves, because the companies are doing the direct-to-consumer sales currently. and they probably will step into this arena much faster than the independent producers or any agencies, because it costs money. It costs a significant amount of money. And as it stands right now, there is that exemption under the Producer Licensing Model Act that lets them actually use these kind of systems, except for current law will make them liable. So I'm not sure it's any different than it is now, because they don't have to get licensed as a person if they're working for a company. But if they step over the line, which they're more likely to if you're using an AI entity, then the company is on the hook for everything and every piece of damage that gets caused. But I would say as regulators, we're already standing in that spot, even for the chatbots or for representatives who work or do direct sales from an insurance carrier directly down to us.
So does this now roll itself into market conduct reviews, and what are the regulators going to count on? Are they looking for complaints to trigger things? I mean, how is this going to get uncovered when there's problems?
Yeah, so what we've been already looking at is the idea of, and we have been talking to some of the carriers about this, is trying to get real-time data instead of looking back. Usually market conduct is based on reviewing complaints that came in the past. But if we can get real-time data on how the interactions of the data entities are actually talking or dealing with consumers, then that's actually faster. We can get the programs and the companies to make their programmers make the coding changed faster, and I think that's a plus, because that way it stops the bleed. If you have a risk out there, you want to make sure that risk gets taken care of quite quickly. The problem is that still relies on the fact that most of the systems are using those decision trees. So you can actually go in and find out where the halt is in your decision tree if you're a coder. If it switches over to the artificial intelligence and electronic person where they're actually doing their own learning, basically what we've been told is that that black box becomes almost like trying to figure out what's going on inside somebody's head. You don't necessarily know. There's not a decision tree. That's just used to get them started. But once they're learning on their own, you may not know where they've stepped into a faulty situation.
So it's not as simple as, a company that's not following its own underwriting guidelines, where there's an actual, policy that can be held up against the behavior. That this gets a little more complicated than that. Yeah,
it does. I mean, much like we talked about the algorithm for hiring, is you don't know it until all of a sudden you're hiring only male and you're trying to figure out how that happened. And it wasn't because they were asking for all men. It's just the data set that they used created that situation. So
we have a question on self-driving cars. I'm not quite sure, but maybe since you're on the Innovation Task Force, you might have some ideas about this. But when it comes to a self-driving car and there's an accident, who's held responsible is the question.
So it depends on what level of self-driving the car they are. If you're talking about the level 5, at this point, they're still considering that all the level 5s, which is the final, drives all by itself kind of car, that goes back to the manufacturer of the car itself. I mean, also keep in mind those, the sensors on each one of those cars are about $80,000 a piece, and there's hundreds of sensors. These are not cars that people themselves are going to own. They're all fleet type of cars. So, as the cars that we run into and the accidents we're running into now is the ones that are partially autonomous, and half the time it's the consumer who turned off the safety feature, so that it becomes their problem. But there is a line between who has control and who can actually afford to even actually own some of these autonomous vehicles. If you can afford to own one, then you probably can deal with the fact that the cost of insurance is going to be extraordinarily high.
Got it. Awesome. So I think that's it for questions. Did you have more material to run through, or are you pretty much there?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much there. I think really for me the big thing that I wanted to keep on stressing for everybody is it's not a nightmare, even if you love those scary movies like I do. there are opportunities here, and I think we should try to embrace those opportunities and not let them go just because there are things that scare us. We're talking about the average life salesperson is in their high 50s right now, and then the life insurance policies are now being sold in new and innovative new ways. That's not a bad thing. We need to all sort of figure out ways to make it over that next hurdle. And sometimes it takes a little bit of experimenting. As long as you think through what the consequences are, it should work. But I'm always concerned that folks might take that one step too far without sort of looking through, thinking about, and maybe consulting. And I always say this: you consult with your regulator because we're all learning together. So it's not like we have all the answers and everything's perfect, but it is a good way to start those kind of conversations so we can all see where the lines are.
Absolutely. Is there a particular meeting at NEIC that is covering these topics for people who attend?
So the meetings that we're sort of focusing on right now is the artificial intelligence. There's a work group. Then there's the innovation and technology task force. They're actually looking at ethics for reviewing the potential of, should there be ethics issues that we can, consider or should be concerned with as we're looking at bringing on new technology in the insurance world. Like, for example, the one that might cause fraud issues. And they're looking currently at the EU sort of set of principles as a standard to try to figure out whether or not that's something that the U.S. Insurance groups could sort of look to. When you develop any kind of artificial intelligence, it should be intended for the best use of the consumer. And that sounds all well and good. And if at least that's what you're trying to do, then you actually have made steps towards sort of focusing everybody's attention on the right thing. So that's what's passing through the NEIC right now that might be interesting to listen to or pay attention to on this particular type of topic.
Fantastic. We're at Ray Bradbury stage where the rules for robots are going into effect. Where first do no harm. I think that's where we're at. We have one last question. I think it's an easy one. Is the exemption for carriers licensing for direct-to-consumer sales in the GLBA? I think it's in the Producer Licensing Model Act. Is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So I would redirect you to the PLMA. And Commissioner Richardson, that was amazing. Thank you so much for enlightening us on this super important topic. For everyone who's still on the call, you'll be getting a follow-up survey. We'd appreciate you filling out. It helps us improve for next time. And speaking of next time, we're working on the lineup, speakers and topics for 2020. We'd love to have suggestions for topics that you find interesting or that you're burning interest in finding out more about. We will reconvene in January, but this webinar in particular will be available for viewing on the SILA Foundation website. So for the next 3 months, you can go into webinars under the Public Resources tab, and you can listen to this one again, or you can turn some new people onto it, because I think this was really fascinating. I can't thank you enough, Commissioner, I know how busy you are, and I know how tough it was to get this time on your schedule. So thank you so much for being with us today and for supporting SILA.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and you guys, like I said, you do a great job, and just keep doing it.
All right, thanks everybody. See you in January. Happy holidays.